All right, strap in, everybody. We are diving deep into some serious political strategy
Oh,
today.
yeah, it's going to be a wild ride.
We are looking at Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. It's basically a blueprint, like a playbook, for how a conservative U.S. president could reshape America, starting in 2025.
Ambitious.
Super ambitious. And I have to say, expert speaker, you are the perfect person to break this down for us. You've got all that historical context. Give us
Yeah.
the lowdown. What's the big deal about this mandate thing?
Well, you got to think back to 1981, Ronald Reagan's time. There was a similar project back then.
Really?
Yeah. And you want to know the crazy part? Over half of the ideas in that document, they actually became policy, like within a year.
No way.
Yeah. So this new mandate, it's taking on some huge topics. We're talking about the future of the American family, how the U.S. deals with China. It's a big deal.
So this isn't just some theoretical pie-in-the-sky stuff. They're serious about turning these ideas into action.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
Well, okay then. For everyone listening, let's unpack this thing. What are conservatives truly concerned about? And how do they actually want to change America? Give us the highlights.
I think it all boils down to power. Really, where does the power lie? And this document, it's all about shifting those power dynamics across the government.
Interesting. So, where better to start than the very top, right? The White House. What's the game plan for 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? What do they want to do?
They want a White House that's not just reacting, a
Yeah.
White House that's really driving the agenda, pushing things forward.
Actively shaping things.
Exactly. And they get really specific, too. They talk about deputy chiefs of staff, senior advisors. They've thought this through.
I'm getting West Wing vibes here for sure. Lots of behind-the-scenes strategizing.
Totally. But it's more than just, efficiency or organization.
Right.
They're laser focused on specific policy areas, too.
Like what? Give us an example.
One of the biggies is what they call the family crisis.
Ah, yeah, I've heard that phrase before.
But their solutions are pretty interesting, actually. It's not just the typical talking points. They actually want to use the tax code, incentivize family formation. It's a pretty direct pushback against what they see as a decline in like traditional values.
That's a powerful lever to pull, for sure. Using the tax code to shape social behavior.
Exactly.
It shows you how serious they are about this.
Oh, absolutely.
They also call out the Office of Public Liaison specifically. What's the strategy there?
So that's the connection between the White House and all sorts of interest groups, right?
Right.
This document talks about using both, carrots and sticks.
Rewards and punishments.
Exactly. Rewards for groups that align with their agenda, penalties for those who don't.
So a White House that's not afraid to flex its muscles a bit.
Exactly. Proactive, maybe even a little intimidating.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big shift from like a hands-off approach.
For sure. Okay, let's keep moving. What about the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB? That's where the money's at.
Right. You'd think it's all about number crunching, but they see it as way more than that.
How so?
They see it as like this key tool for actually driving their policies.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. How do they want to change the OMB?
They're talking about like dividing up some of the existing divisions, making them smaller, more specialized.
Interesting. And why is that important?
Well, think about it. This would open up more opportunities for politically appointed deputy directors.
Ah, I see where you're going with this. It's about control, right?
Exactly. By putting more people who align with their agenda into those positions, they can influence how policies actually get implemented across all the different agencies.
It's a very subtle but powerful move.
Oh, they're thinking strategically, for sure. Every level.
What about national security? I imagine that's high on their list.
Absolutely. The National Security Council, the NSC, that's a big one.
Right, shaping foreign policy and all that.
Exactly. They want an NSC that's much more streamlined,
Yeah.
Working really closely with the rest of the White House staff.
Okay, so a tight ship, everyone on the same page.
Yeah, but here's a really interesting detail. They want the NSC to have its own legal counsel, separate from the White House counsel.
Wait, hold on. Why is that such a big deal?
Well, it suggests they want the SC to be able to operate with a degree of independence, especially when it comes to, like, interpreting legal issues related to national security.
So it's about being able to act quickly and decisively, maybe even without having to go through all the usual White House channels.
You got it. A clear chain of command, but also specialized expertise at each level. They're thinking this through very carefully.
Okay, makes sense. What about the National Economic Council, NEC? What's their vision for that?
They talk a lot about messaging and media engagement.
Ah, controlling the narrative.
Exactly. They want the NEC to be out there explaining the president's economic policies to the public, really shaping how people understand what's going on.
And it's not just about explaining things, right? There's also an element of like pushing back against criticism, maybe even shaping the news cycle a bit.
Oh, totally. And
Yeah.
here's another interesting detail. They want the NEC to have a say in who gets appointed to financial regulatory agencies.
So it's about control, right? Making sure everyone is on the same page when it comes to economic policy. And that includes the people who are actually responsible for regulating the financial industry.
Exactly.
Okay, what about science and technology? The Office of Science and Technology Policy, what's their take on that?
This is where it gets really interesting. They're calling for a big review of something called the United States Global Change Research Program.
Okay, and what is that exactly?
Well, it's basically a government program that looks at climate change.
Ah, okay.
And they're specifically interested in anything that was produced under the Biden administration.
I see. So they're not necessarily saying they don't believe in climate change,
Right.
but they're definitely skeptical of some of the research that's been done on it.
And they want to limit the influence of this program and other related research components within the executive office of the president. It's like they want to put a check on certain types of scientific findings, especially if those findings might challenge their policy goals.
Interesting. So it's not just about budget cuts, right? It's about shaping the very information that gets used to make policy decisions.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that affects everyone who works for the government. I'm talking about the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM.
The HR department for the entire federal government.
Exactly. So what kind of changes do they have in mind for the OPM?
They want to completely overhaul how federal employees are hired.
Big changes.
Yeah. They think the current system doesn't do a good job of actually separating the best candidates from, everyone else.
So they want a more rigorous screening process.
Something like that. And get this, they want to roll back some of the regulations that prevent the use of IQ tests in federal hiring.
Wow, okay. That's going to be controversial, to say the least. I mean, those regulations were put in place to prevent discrimination, right?
Exactly. To make sure the hiring process is fair, especially for minorities. But this document, it argues that those regulations are actually hurting the quality of the federal workforce.
So they're willing to revisit some pretty sensitive issues in the name of efficiency and what they see as merit-based hiring.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the Merit Systems Protection Board, the MSPB? That's the agency that handles appeals from federal employees who feel like they've been treated unfairly, right?
Yeah, you got it. And they are not fans of how the MSPB works right now.
Why not? What's the problem?
Oh, they say it's way too slow, too bureaucratic, huge backlog of cases.
Okay, so a classic complaint about government bureaucracy. Things move too slowly.
Exactly. And they argue that, this lengthy appeals process, it actually protects underperforming employees.
I see. So it makes it harder to hold people accountable because they can drag things out with appeals?
Right. And they think it ultimately makes it tougher for managers to actually manage.
So streamlining things, speeding up the process, that seems to be the goal there.
For sure.
Okay, what about the Federal Labor Relations Authority and the Office of Special Counsel? Any big changes proposed for those agencies?
Actually, they want to completely restructure all four of the personnel management agencies. The OPM, the MSQB, the FLRA, the OSC.
Okay, all of them. Big changes across the board. What are they thinking?
They want to consolidate them, maybe even put them under the direct control of the president.
Wow, that's a huge power shift.
Oh, yeah. And they even suggest giving the OPM director a seat in the cabinet.
Really? Wow. So it's clear they want the president to have much more direct control over the federal workforce.
No doubt about it. That's a consistent theme we're seeing, for sure.
Okay, let's switch gears again. Talk about the departments. We'll start with the big one, the Department of Defense. What's their vision for the military?
Oh, they're calling for a major military buildup.
Like, how major are we talking?
Think modernizing and expanding the nuclear arsenal, making our defense industry even stronger.
Okay, so a more assertive posture on the world stage. What's driving that?
Well, it's pretty clear they see China as the biggest threat.
Right. China comes up a lot in this document.
It's like their main focus, and they want to make sure that the U.S. and our allies are the top priority when it comes to buying weapons and equipment.
Okay, so peace through strength, that classic conservative approach to national security.
Exactly.
But what about domestic security? The Department of Homeland Security, that seems like a big one for conservatives.
Oh yeah, huge. Securing the border, enforcing immigration laws, making the whole department run more efficiently, that's their focus.
Give me some specifics. How do they want to achieve that?
Well, they even suggest soft closing offices that aren't effective, shifting those resources to, border security, immigration enforcement.
Soft closing. That sounds kind of ominous. What does that even mean for people who work in those offices?
It's not super clear, but it seems like they want to downsize certain parts of DHS pretty significantly.
Okay, so a leaner, meaner DHS focused laser-like on immigration and border security.
Exactly. And they want to limit the use of things like parole.
Remind me what parole is in this context.
It's basically a way to temporarily allow certain immigrants into the country.
Okay, got it.
And they want to limit alternatives to detention, too. Those are programs that let some immigrants stay with family or in community settings while they await their court dates.
So a much stricter approach to immigration overall. No more like leniency or second chances.
Pretty much.
Okay, let's move on to something a little closer to home. The Department of Agriculture. What's their plan for the USDA?
They're really pushing back against how the Biden administration has been handling food policy. All that focus on climate change and equity, they're not fans.
So what do they want instead?
They want to get back to basics, supporting farmers, making sure food production is efficient, removing any government barriers that prevent people from accessing food.
So a more traditional view of the USDA's role.
Exactly. Back to the core mission.
Interesting. Okay, what about education? The Department of Education is always a hot-button issue. What's their take on that?
You ready for this?
Hit me.
They actually propose getting rid of the Department of Education completely.
Whoa, okay, that's a big one.
Yeah.
But what would happen to all the programs the Department of Education runs? Where would they go?
They talk about distributing them to other agencies. And they're big on school choice, giving parents more options.
Right, including using public funds to send kids to private schools.
Exactly. It's a pretty radical change, for sure.
It would be hugely controversial, but it shows you how serious they are about shrinking the federal government.
For sure.
Okay, speaking of shrinking the government, what about the Department of Energy? Big plans for that one.
They want to refocus the national labs, have them do more fundamental scientific research.
And what about things like technology development and deployment?
Leave that to the private sector, they say. And they want to get rid of taxpayer subsidies for things like renewable energy.
Ah, so less government involvement in the energy sector overall.
Exactly. They think those subsidies distort the market, pick winners and losers.
So a very free market approach to energy policy.
No surprises there.
Okay, what about the Department of the Interior? That's a big one, covering everything from national parks to oil drilling.
Yeah, it's a lot. They're big on increasing domestic energy production,
Okay, how would they do that?
opening up more federal lands to oil and gas leasing, making it easier for companies to get permits for infrastructure projects. They were not happy about the Biden administration putting limits on energy development.
So a more pro-development, pro-industry stance when it comes to managing our natural resources.
For sure.
Okay, what about the Department of Justice? I feel like that's one where we could see some pretty major changes.
Yeah, for sure. Cracking down on illegal immigration is a big one. Beefing up prosecutions for immigration offenses, streamlining the FBI, those are their top priorities.
Okay, so a tougher approach to law enforcement, particularly when it comes to immigration.
Exactly. And they're not fans of the FBI's role in things like combating misinformation and disinformation online.
They see that as overreach.
Yeah, they're concerned about the government getting too involved in policing what people say online.
Okay, so a more limited role for the FBI with a focus on what they see as its core law enforcement functions.
Right. Sticking to the basics.
What about the Department of Labor? What kind of changes do they envision there?
They're all about rolling back regulations. Anything that they see as burdensome to businesses, they want to get rid of. They also want to make it easier for companies to classify workers as independent contractors, which would mean those workers wouldn't be covered by certain labor protections.
Right. So it would be up to the individual worker to negotiate their own terms and conditions rather than having those protections guaranteed by law.
Exactly. And here's a curveball for you. They want to prevent retirement funds and pension plans from considering environmental, social, and governance factors when they make investment decisions.
ESG factors. Remind me what that's all about.
It's the idea that Investors should consider a company's impact on things like the environment, social justice, that kind of thing, when they make decisions about where to put their money.
Right, so it's about using your investment power to push for positive social change.
Exactly. But conservatives, they see it as like a way to politicize investing, to push a liberal agenda.
I see. So this document is really about pushing back against what they see as like liberal overreach in all areas of government.
Totally. It's a consistent theme throughout the document.
Okay, we're making good progress here. What about the Department of Transportation? Any big plans for that one?
Oh yeah, this is a big one for them. They're not fans of the Biden administration's fuel economy standards or California's ability to like set its own stricter standards.
Right, California has always been a leader when it comes to environmental regulations.
Exactly. And they want to change that. They want to prioritize things like cost, consumer choice, safety, and national security when setting those standards.
So, a more market-driven approach to fuel efficiency.
Right. Let the market decide.
Okay, what about veterans? The Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, that's a huge responsibility. What does this document have to say about that?
They're worried about the VA's management and bureaucracy.
So, a classic conservative concern.
Exactly. They don't think the VA is doing enough to actually provide veteran-centric care.
Okay, so what's their solution?
They want to bring in more experts from the private sector and academia to help improve care.
So, more outside perspectives, less reliance on the traditional VA bureaucracy.
Right. They also recommend a full-blown independent audit of the VA.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. They want to identify any deficiencies, make sure the VA's facilities are actually located in the right places, that sort of thing.
So, efficiency and accountability, those seem to be the big themes there.
For sure.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here with the departments. Now, let's dive into the world of intelligence. What's their vision for the intelligence community, the IC?
Oh, they want the IC to be much more aggressive, particularly towards China, Russia, Iran, North Korea.
So, a more assertive posture towards our adversaries?
Exactly. They talk about empowering the right personnel, although what that actually means, who knows?
Right, it's a little vague.
But they also talk about getting rid of any redundancies or infighting, anything that might be slowing down intelligence gathering and analysis.
So, streamlining the IC, making sure everyone is on the same page and working towards the same goals.
Exactly.
Okay, what about specific agencies within the intelligence community? Do they single any of those out?
Oh yeah, they definitely mention the CIA.
Really? The CIA, what do they want to do with the CIA?
They want to take a close look at its operations, especially overseas.
Mm-hmm.
Any covert actions the CIA has been involved in, they want to know about it. And they emphasize that the CIA needs to be in sync with the State Department's official foreign policy.
Ah, I see. So it's about making sure everyone is on the same page, especially when it comes to espionage, which can be a very sensitive area.
For sure.
Okay, what about the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI? That's supposed to be the agency that coordinates everything in the intelligence community, right?
Yeah, the big boss. And they want to give the DNI more power to actually lead and oversee the whole intelligence community, like managing budgets, making appointments, that kind of thing.
So a more powerful DNI with more control over the individual agencies.
Exactly. Make sure everyone is working towards the president's priorities.
Got it. What about intelligence sharing? We hear so much about how important it is to share intelligence with our allies. What do they have to say about that?
They're a little cautious, actually. They want to be very strategic about when and how we share intelligence, especially classified information.
So no blind trust.
Right. They emphasize protecting our sources and methods.
Okay, makes sense. A more calculated approach to intelligence sharing. All right, let's move on to something completely different. The media. Specifically, the U.S. Agency for Global Media. What's their take on that?
They're really worried about security at the USAGM. There have been reports that have identified vulnerabilities to foreign spies, and they want to make sure everyone working there is properly vetted.
So they're concerned about foreign influence within the USAGM. But what about its overall mission? Do they think it's doing a good job of promoting American values and interests abroad?
Not really. They want to reform it, maybe even restructure the whole agency. They talk about reducing redundancies, clarifying its mission.
Okay, so a more secure and streamlined USAGM focused on promoting American interests abroad. Got it. What's next on our whirlwind tour of the federal government?
Let's talk foreign aid.
Okay, USAI, the Agency for International Development. What's their vision for that?
They want to shift USAID's focus away from, like, traditional development assistance, things like providing basic health care and education.
So less about handouts, more about something else.
Right. They want to prioritize things like promoting economic growth and countering Chinese influence.
Ah, there's China again. So it's about using foreign aid as a tool to advance American interests on the global stage.
Exactly. They also want to work more closely with faith-based organizations and the private sector, less reliance on, big government programs.
Okay, interesting shift in priorities there. Now, trade is always a big issue for conservatives. What do they have to say about the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR?
They want a USTR who shares the president's vision for trade, that's for sure. Someone who's going to fight for what they see as fair, balanced, and reciprocal trade deals.
So someone who's tough, who's not going to back down from a fight.
Exactly. They're really worried about China's economic practices, and they want someone who's willing to take a hard line in negotiations.
So no more business as usual when it comes to trade with China.
Definitely not.
What about the International Trade Administration, the ITA? That's the agency that's supposed to help American businesses compete globally, right?
Yeah, they see it as a key tool for advancing those conservative priorities on trade and investment.
So helping American businesses succeed in the global marketplace. But how? What kind of specific actions are they proposing?
They argue that, the U.S. can't be naive about trade.
Right.
We need to be willing to use every tool we have to protect our interests.
So playing hardball, not being afraid to use tariffs or other trade barriers to give American businesses an advantage.
Exactly. Leveling the playing field.
Okay, what about the Export-Import Bank? That's the one that provides financing to foreign buyers of American products, right?
Yeah, and it's actually a bit controversial even among conservatives.
Well, hey, how so?
Well, some of them want to get rid of it completely. They see it as corporate welfare. They think it doesn't actually help promote exports.
Interesting. So there's a debate within the conservative movement about whether this agency is even necessary.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But others, they see it as a tool we need, to support American jobs and counter, guess who?
China.
Bingo. They point to China's aggressive lending practices and say we need to do the same. It'll be interesting to see how that debate plays out if a conservative president takes office.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about the Federal Reserve, the Fed. That's the big one when it comes to economic policy. What do they want to do with the Fed?
They want to limit its power and independence, basically.
Okay, how would they do that?
They want to restrict the Fed's ability to buy things other than U.S. Treasury bonds,
Okay,
and they want to shrink the Fed's balance sheet.
which is already huge.
Yeah. They're worried the Fed has way too much power, that it can manipulate the economy too easily. They want to rein it in.
So a much smaller role for the Fed in managing the economy.
Exactly.
Okay, what about the Small Business Administration, the SBA? That's the agency that provides loans and support to small businesses.
They acknowledge that the SBA is important, especially during crises like the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, when businesses were struggling to stay afloat.
But they also worry about waste and fraud in some of the SBA's programs.
So a classic conservative concern about government inefficiency.
Right. They want to streamline the agency,
Hmm.
make it more accountable, focus on those core missions,
Mm.
like providing loans and counseling.
Okay, so make the SBA more efficient and effective. That sounds reasonable enough. What about the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA? Any big plans for NOAA?
They want to transfer some of NOAA's responsibilities to other agencies, like the Coast Guard, the U.S. Geological Survey.
Why is that?
They say it would just be more efficient. They also want to review NOAA's expansion of the National Marine Sanctuary System.
Interesting. That suggests they might want to scale back NOAA's environmental protection efforts.
Could be. It's not explicitly stated, but it's definitely something to watch.
Okay, we're almost through our list of agencies here. Let's talk about the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, everyone's favorite.
Right. Well, they paint a pretty bleak picture of the IRS, let me tell you.
Like what? What's their beef with the IRS?
Poorly managed, unresponsive, increasingly politicized. Those are some of the words they use.
Oh.
They want to reform it, make it more efficient, protect taxpayer rights, and make it more transparent and accountable.
So a more user-friendly IRS, basically. Good luck with that.
Right. And they actually admit that a lot of the problems stem from the complexity of the tax code itself.
Which is something pretty much everyone agrees on. Simplify the tax code, make the IRS more user-friendly. It seems like a tall order. Okay, just one more agency on our list for today. The U.S. Trade and Development Agency. What do they have to say about that one?
This one's pretty straightforward. Get rid of it.
Just like that. Another agency bites the dust.
They say it's redundant, basically corporate welfare.
They're really serious about shrinking the federal government. All right, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the White House to the departments to all those alphabet soup agencies.
Phew, I'm exhausted.
Me too. But we're not done yet. Next time, we're going to tackle the independent regulatory agencies, like the FCC, the SEC, the FTC. Those are the ones that really have a direct impact on our daily lives.
Oh yeah, those are the ones that make the rules, the ones with the real power. Can't wait to dig into those.
Stay tuned, everyone. It's going to be a wild ride.
Now let's talk about something that affects everyone who works for the government. The Office of Personnel Management.
The OPM?
You got it.
Yeah.
And they want to like completely overhaul the way federal employees are hired.
Interesting.
Yeah, they say the current system just doesn't do a good job of finding the best people, separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak.
So they want to make it more competitive.
More rigorous,
Yeah.
for sure. And get this, they actually want to roll back regulations that prevent using IQ tests for hiring.
Wow, that's going to ruffle some feathers for sure. I mean, those regulations exist for a reason, right?
Yeah, they were put in place to try to prevent discrimination, especially against minorities.
Right, make sure things are fair.
Exactly. But this document argues that those regulations are actually hurting the quality of the federal workforce.
So they're basically saying that those regulations are doing more harm than good.
That's their argument.
Yeah. Okay, so a pretty controversial proposal right there. But it shows you how much emphasis they put on what they consider to be merit-based hiring.
Oh, yeah, efficiency, competence.
Yeah.
Those are big themes for them.
Okay, what about the Merit Systems Protection Board? The MSPB. That's the agency that handles appeals from federal employees who feel like they've been treated unfairly.
Right, and they're not happy with the MSPB, how it is now.
What don't they like about it?
Too slow, too bureaucratic, huge backlog of cases, like the drill.
The wheels of government turning slowly.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
And they actually argue that this whole lengthy appeals process ends up protecting underperforming employees.
Interesting.
How so? Because it drags things out, right?
Yeah.
So even if a manager has a legitimate reason to discipline someone, that employee can just tie things up in appeals for like forever.
So it makes it harder to hold people accountable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes it harder for managers to actually manage.
So they want to streamline the process, speed things up, make it easier to remove underperforming employees.
That's the gist of it. Yeah.
Okay, what about the Federal Labor Relations Authority and the Office of the Special Counsel? Any major changes proposed for those agencies?
Yeah, actually, they have this pretty radical idea. They want to restructure all 4 of the personnel management agencies.
Whoa, all 4. So the OPM, the MSPB we just talked about, the FLRA, and the OSC.
Yep, the whole shebang. They want to consolidate them, maybe even put them all under the direct control of the president.
Wow, that's a big shift in power dynamic.
For sure. And get this, they even suggest giving the OPM director a seat in the cabinet.
Really? Wow, they're serious about this.
Oh, yeah. They want the president to have a lot more direct control over the federal workforce. That's a very clear message here.
Makes sense given everything else we've talked about so far.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the departments now, starting with the big one, the Department of Defense. What do they have in mind for the military?
Oh, they want a major buildup. No question about it.
Okay, but like how major are we talking?
Think modernizing the nuclear arsenal, expanding it, strengthening the defense industry, and making sure that the U.S. and its allies are always top priority when it comes to buying weapons and equipment.
So a classic peace through strength approach.
Exactly. That's the idea. Projecting power on the world stage.
And who's the main target of all this power projection?
China? No
Yeah,
surprises there.
Right, China has come up a lot in this document so far.
It's their main focus. They
Mhm.
see China as the biggest threat to American interests, both economically and militarily.
Okay, so a more assertive, more powerful military with a clear focus on China.
Got it. What about the Department of Homeland Security? That seems like a big one for conservatives.
Oh yeah, huge. One of their top priorities. They're all about securing the border, enforcing immigration laws, and making the whole department run more efficiently.
Give me some specifics. What kind of changes are they proposing?
Well, they even suggest soft closing offices that aren't effective.
Soft closing. What does that even mean? It's a little vague, but it sounds like they want to significantly downsize certain parts of DHS.
Okay, so streamline the agency, focus on what they see as the core missions.
Exactly. And they also want to limit the use of things like parole, which is a way to temporarily allow certain immigrants into the country.
Right, and they want to restrict alternatives to detention, too. Those programs that let some immigrants stay with family or in community settings while they wait for their court dates.
Yep, they want a much stricter approach to immigration overall, Less leniency, fewer loopholes.
Got it. So a leaner, meaner DHS, laser focused on border security and immigration enforcement.
Pretty much sums it up.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about something a little closer to home. The Department of Agriculture. What's their plan for the USDA?
Well, they're not happy with how the Biden administration has been running things. They think there's been too much focus on climate change and equity.
So what do they want instead?
They want to get back to the basics. Supporting farmers, making sure food production is efficient, and removing any government barriers that prevent people from accessing food.
So a more traditional view of the USDA's role, less about social engineering, more about supporting the agricultural industry.
Exactly.
Okay, what about education? The Department of Education is always a controversial one. What's
Yeah.
their take on that?
Oh, this is a big one. You ready for this?
Hit me.
They actually propose eliminating the Department of Education altogether.
Whoa, okay. That's a pretty radical proposal.
Yeah.
What would happen to all the programs the Department of Education runs? Where would they go?
They talk about distributing those programs to other agencies.
Yeah.
And they're big on school choice. Giving parents more options for where to send their kids to school.
Right, including using public funds to send kids to private schools.
Exactly. It's a
Yeah.
huge change, and it would be incredibly controversial. But it shows you how serious they are about shrinking the federal government.
No doubt about it. Okay, speaking of shrinking the government, what about the Department of Energy? Any big plans for that one?
They want to refocus the national labs.
Yeah.
Have them focus more on fundamental scientific research.
And what about things like developing and deploying new energy technologies?
Leave that to the private sector, they say.
Yeah.
And they want to get rid of all those taxpayer subsidies for things like renewable energy.
So a much smaller role for the government in the energy sector.
Exactly. They think the government shouldn't be picking winners and losers in the energy market.
A very free market approach.
Yep. Let the market decide.
Okay, what about the Department of the Interior? That's the one that oversees everything from national parks to oil drilling, right?
Right. And they're very much in favor of increasing domestic energy production.
How so?
They want to open up more federal lands to oil and gas leasing, make it easier for companies to get permits for infrastructure projects, that sort of thing.
So a more pro-development, pro-industry approach to managing our natural resources.
Yeah, they weren't happy with the Biden administration's limits on energy development. They want to reverse that trend.
Okay, so a pretty clear shift in priorities there. What are the Department of Justice? That's a big one. I imagine they have some strong opinions about how that should be run.
Oh, yeah. They're focused on cracking down on illegal immigration, beefing up prosecutions for immigration offenses, streamlining the FBI.
Okay, so a more law and order approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they specifically want to limit the FBI's role in things like combating misinformation and disinformation online.
They see that as government overreach.
Yeah, they're worried about the government getting too involved in policing speech online. They want
Yeah.
to keep that to a minimum.
Okay, so a more limited role for the FBI focused on more traditional law enforcement activities.
Yep, that's the idea.
What about the Department of Labor? What kind of changes do they envision for that one?
They want to get rid of regulations that they see as burdensome to businesses.
So a classic conservative approach.
Yeah,
Less regulation, more freedom for businesses to operate.
exactly. And they want to make it easier for companies to classify workers as independent contractors.
Which would mean those workers wouldn't be entitled to the same protections as regular employees.
Right.
Right, things like minimum wage overtime pay.
Right. It would be up to the individual worker to negotiate those things with their employer.
Okay, so a pretty significant change in the balance of power between employers and employees.
And here's another interesting one. They want to prevent retirement funds and pension plans from considering ESG factors when making investment decisions.
ESG factors. Remind me what that stands for again?
Environmental, social, and governance factors.
Yeah.
It's basically the idea that investors should think about a company's impact on things like the environment and social justice when they decide where to put their money.
Right. So it's about using your investment power to try to make the world a better place.
Exactly. But conservatives, they see it as a way to politicize investing to push a liberal agenda.
So they want to keep those considerations out of investment decisions.
That's right. They think investment decisions should be based purely on financial factors.
Okay, so a clear ideological divide there. What about the Department of Transportation? Any big plans for that one?
Oh, yeah, they're not fans of the Biden administration's fuel economy standards.
Those standards that require car manufacturers to make more fuel-efficient vehicles?
Exactly. They think those standards are too strict and that they hurt the auto industry.
Or they want to roll them back?
Yeah, they want to prioritize things like cost consumer choice, safety, and national security when setting those standards.
So a more market-driven approach to fuel efficiency.
Exactly. Let the market decide what kinds of cars people want to buy.
Okay, what about veterans? The Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA. That's a huge responsibility. What does this document have to say about the VA?
They're concerned about the VA's management and bureaucracy. They don't think it's doing enough to provide what they call veteran-centric care.
So they want to make the VA more efficient, more responsive to the needs of veterans?
Exactly. They want to encourage VA medical centers to get more input from experts in the private sector and academia.
So bring in some outside perspectives.
Right. And they also recommend a full-blown independent audit of the VA.
Really? Wow. They're serious about this.
Yeah, they want to identify any deficiencies, make sure the VA's facilities are located in the right places and that they're providing cost-effective care.
So efficiency, accountability, those are the big themes when it comes to the VA.
For sure.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground with the departments. Now let's dive into the world of intelligence. What's their vision for the intelligence community?
They want the IC to be much more aggressive, especially towards China, Russia, Iran, North Korea.
So a more assertive posture towards our adversaries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They talk about empowering the right personnel, although what that actually means, who
That is
knows.
a little vague, yeah.
But they also want to get rid of any redundancies or infighting that might be hindering intelligence gathering and analysis.
So streamline the intelligence community, make sure everyone is on the same page.
Exactly.
Did they call out any specific agencies within the intelligence community?
Oh, yeah, they definitely mentioned the CIA.
The CIA. What do they want to do with the CIA?
They want to take a close look at its operations, especially overseas. They want to know about any covert actions the CIA has been involved in, and they really emphasize the need for the CIA to be in sync with the State Department's official foreign policy.
So they want to make sure the CIA isn't going rogue, basically.
Right. No freelancing. They want the CIA to be a tool of American foreign policy, not an independent actor.
Okay, what about the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI? That's supposed to be the agency that coordinates everything in the intelligence community, right?
Exactly. And they want to give the DNI more power to actually lead and oversee the whole intelligence community, including things like managing budgets and making appointments.
And so a more powerful, more centralized DNI.
Yeah, someone who can really crack the whip and make sure all the different agencies are working together towards the president's priorities.
Got it. What about intelligence sharing? We always hear about how important it is to share intelligence with our allies. What do they have to say about that?
They're a little cautious about it, actually. They want to be very strategic about when and with whom we share intelligence, especially classified information.
So no blind trust.
Right. They emphasize the need to protect our sources and methods.
Which makes sense. I mean, you don't want to risk compromising your intelligence gathering capabilities.
Exactly. You have to be careful who you trust.
Okay, so a more calculated approach to intelligence sharing. Got it. Let's move on to something completely different now. The media, specifically the U.S. Agency for Global Media. What's their take on that one?
They're really worried about security at the USAGM. There have been reports that have identified vulnerabilities to foreign spies, and they want to make sure everyone working there is properly vetted.
So they're concerned about foreign influence within the USAGM, but what about its overall mission? Do they think it's doing a good job of promoting American values and interests abroad?
Not really. They want to reform it, maybe even restructure the whole agency. They talk about reducing redundancies, clarifying its mission, making sure it's actually effective.
Okay, so a more secure and streamlined USAGM focused laser-like on promoting American interests abroad.
That's the idea.
Got it. What's next on our whirlwind tour of the federal government?
Let's talk foreign aid. The Agency for International Development, or USAID. What do they want to do with that?
Okay, USAID, that's the agency that provides development assistance to other countries, right?
Exactly. And they want to shift its focus away from traditional development assistance, things like providing basic healthcare and education.
So less about just giving handouts.
Right. They want to prioritize things like promoting economic growth and countering Chinese influence.
Ah, there's China again. So it's about using foreign aid as a tool to advance American interests on the global stage.
Exactly. And they also want to work more closely with faith-based organizations and the private sector, less reliance on big government programs.
Okay, interesting shift in priorities there. Now, trade is always a big issue for conservatives.
Yeah.
What do they have to say about the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR?
They want a USTR who shares the president's vision for trade, that's for sure. Someone who's going to fight for what they see as fair, balanced, and reciprocal trade deals.
So someone who's tough, who's not going to back down from a fight.
Exactly. They're really worried about China's economic practices, and they want someone who's willing to take a hard line in negotiations.
No more business as usual when it comes to trade with China.
Definitely not.
Yeah. What about the International Trade Administration, the ITA? That's the agency that's supposed to help American businesses compete globally, right?
Yep, and they see it as a key tool for advancing conservative priorities on trade and investment.
So helping American businesses succeed in the global marketplace, but what kind of specific actions are they proposing?
They argue that the U.S. can't be naive about trade. You know,
Right.
we need to be willing to use all the tools at our disposal to protect our interests.
So playing hardball, not being afraid to use tariffs or other trade barriers to give American businesses an advantage.
Exactly, leveling the playing field.
Okay, what about the Export-Import Bank? That's the one that provides financing to foreign buyers of American products, right?
Yeah, and this one is actually a bit controversial even among conservatives.
Really? How so?
While some conservatives want to get rid of it completely, they see it as corporate welfare. They don't think it actually helps promote exports.
Hmm. Interesting. So there's internal debate within the conservative movement about whether this agency is even necessary.
Oh yeah, for sure. But other conservatives see it as a necessary tool for supporting American jobs and countering China's aggressive lending practices.
Ah, there's China again.
Yeah.
So it's a question of whether the benefits of the Export-Import Bank outweigh the costs in the eyes of conservatives.
Exactly. It'll be interesting to see how that debate plays out if a conservative president takes office.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about the Federal Reserve now. The Fed, that's the big one when it comes to economic policy. What do they want to do with the Fed?
They want to limit its power and independence.
Okay, how would they do that?
They want to restrict the Fed's ability to buy things other than U.S. Treasury bonds.
Okay, so limit its ability to influence the market.
Exactly. And they want to shrink the Fed's balance sheet, which is already huge.
Right, so basically reduce the Fed's role in managing the economy.
That's their goal. They think the Fed has too much power and that it can manipulate the economy too easily. They want to rein it in.
Okay, so a much smaller role for the Fed. What about the Small Business Administration, the SBA? That's the agency that provides loans and support to small businesses.
They acknowledge that the SBA has a role to play, especially during times of crisis like the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, when a lot of small businesses were struggling to stay afloat.
Exactly. But they're also concerned about waste, fraud, and mismanagement in some SBA programs.
So a classic concern about government efficiency.
Right. They want to streamline the agency, make it more accountable, and focus on its core missions like providing loan guarantees and counseling services.
Okay, so make the SBA more efficient and effective.
That's the idea.
What about the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA? Any big plans for that one?
They want to transfer some of NOAA's responsibilities to other agencies like the Coast Guard and the U.S. Geological Survey.
Why is that?
They argue that it would be more efficient. And they also want to review NOAA's expansion of the National Marine Sanctuary System.
Interesting. That suggests they might want to scale back NOAA's environmental protection efforts.
Could be. It's not explicitly stated, but it's definitely something to watch.
Okay, so streamlining NOAA and potentially limiting its reach. What about everyone's favorite agency? The Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. What do they want to do with that?
They paint a pretty bleak picture of the IRS.
Like what are their main criticisms?
They say it's poorly managed, unresponsive, increasingly politicized.
So basically a mess.
Pretty much. They want to reform it, make it more efficient, protect taxpayer rights, increase transparency and accountability.
Sound like a tall order.
It is. And they acknowledge that a lot of the IRS's problems stem from the complexity of the tax code itself.
Which is something pretty much everyone agrees on. Simplify the tax code, make the IRS more user-friendly. It's easier said than done.
For sure.
Okay, one last agency for today. The U.S. Trade and Development Agency. What do they have in mind for that one?
Simple. Get rid of it.
Just like that. Another agency bites the dust.
Yep. They argue that its functions are redundant and that it's basically corporate welfare.
So they see it as unnecessary government spending. Well, it's clear that they're serious about shrinking the federal government. We've gone through a lot of agencies and departments today, and it seems like their main goal is to reduce the size and scope of government.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's a consistent theme throughout this document.
All right, well, we're going to take a break here, but when we come back, we'll be diving into the independent regulatory agencies like the FCC, the SEC, the FTC. Those are the ones that really have a direct impact on our daily lives.
Can't wait to dig into those.
All right, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into the mandate for leadership. We've covered a lot of ground already. The White House, the departments, all those agencies. Now it's time to tackle the independent regulatory agencies. These are the ones that, really have a direct impact on our daily lives. Expert speaker, what's the big picture here? What are conservatives looking to change about these agencies?
Well, they basically want to reduce their power, shrink their scope.
Makes sense.
They see these agencies as unelected bureaucrats who have too much control over the economy and people's lives. They're all about freedom and individual liberty.
Right, less government interference, more freedom for businesses and individuals to make their own choices. That's a classic conservative principle. But let's get specific. What about the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC? That's the one that regulates, like, TV, radio, the internet, all that stuff.
Exactly. And they want a much more assertive FCC, one that actively promotes free speech and competition.
Okay, but how would they do that? What kind of specific actions are they proposing?
Well, they're really interested in using the FCC's power to limit the influence of big tech companies.
Ah, those tech giants we hear so much about. Everyone's worried about their power these days. But how would the FCC actually do that? What tools did they have?
They talk about revisiting Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. That's the law that protects tech companies from being sued for content that their users post.
Right, so if someone posts something defamatory on Facebook, Facebook isn't held liable.
Exactly. But conservatives argue that this law has given tech companies way too much power.
To censor certain viewpoints.
Right. They're worried about conservative voices being silenced online.
So they want to hold these companies more accountable for what appears on their platforms. But changing Section 230, that's a huge GE deal. I mean, that law is basically a cornerstone of the internet as we know it. Changing it could completely reshape how we communicate online.
Oh, absolutely. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Okay, what about the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC? That's the one that regulates the stock market, right? Make sure everything is fair and transparent. What do they want to do with the SEC?
Well, they actually want to make the SEC more powerful. They want to give it more resources, more authority.
Really? I thought conservatives were all about smaller government.
They are, but they also believe in strong enforcement of the rules, especially when it comes to the financial markets. They see a strong SEC as essential for protecting investors and ensuring the integrity of the markets. They also want to streamline the SEC, make it more efficient. They argue that this will benefit both businesses and investors.
Okay, so less bureaucracy, more effective regulation. Makes sense. They also talk about taking a close look at these things called self-regulatory organizations, or SROs. What are those exactly?
So these are groups like the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, or FINRA. They play a role in overseeing the financial industry, but they're not actually part of the government.
So they're kind of like industry watchdogs.
Exactly. But conservatives, they're a little skeptical of these SROs. They argue that they're not accountable enough to the public and that they sometimes create unnecessary burdens for businesses.
So they want to bring them under tighter control.
Right. They suggest merging some of their functions into the SEC to increase transparency and oversight.
Okay, more power to the SEC, less for these industry groups.
Huh.
Got it. Now, what about the Commodity Futures Trading Commission? That one regulates like futures contracts and derivatives, all that complicated financial stuff. What do they want to do with the CFTC?
They want to make sure the CFTC has clear authority to regulate digital assets, things like cryptocurrencies, which have exploded in popularity in recent years.
Right. Crypto is everywhere these days. It's a whole new world of financial instruments, and the old rules might not apply.
Exactly. They also talk about streamlining regulations for those foreign swap trading platforms.
Okay, and what's the thinking there? Why do they want to do that?
Well, they argue that the current rules are hurting American companies. They say it's harder for U.S. companies to compete in these global markets because of all the regulations they have to deal with.
So it's about making American businesses more competitive on the world stage.
That's a big theme for them, for sure.
Okay, what about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB? That's the one that was created after the 2008 financial crisis to protect consumers from, like, predatory lending practices and all that. What's their take on the CFPB?
They're not big fans.
Really? Why not? I mean, it seems like the CFPB has done some good work in protecting consumers.
They think it's too powerful, too unaccountable.
So they want to, like, weaken it.
Basically, yeah. They want to reform it to increase transparency and give Congress more oversight.
So less power for the CFPB, more power for Congress. Okay, what about the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC? That's the one that's supposed to protect consumers from things like monopolies and unfair business practices. What's their plan for the FTC?
Get ready for this one.
Okay, I'm ready.
They actually question whether the FTC should even exist.
Whoa, another agency on the chopping block.
They think its functions could be handled by other agencies, primarily the Department of Justice.
So they're serious about shrinking the federal government. This is a consistent theme we're seeing throughout this document. Okay, one last stop on our deep dive. The Federal Election Commission. That's the one that oversees our elections, makes sure everything is fair and transparent. What do they want to do with the FEC?
Well, they actually support the FEC, but they want to make sure it stays focused on its core mission, which is to enforce election laws fairly and impartially. No bias towards one party or the other.
Right, so a neutral referee in our elections.
Exactly. They're also concerned about what they see as the Department of Justice's overreach in prosecuting campaign finance violations. They argue that those cases should be pursued very carefully, only in the most clear-cut cases. They don't want to see these laws used to target political opponents.
So a level playing field and no weaponization of campaign finance laws. Well, expert speaker, that brings us to the end of our whirlwind tour of the mandate for leadership. It's been a fascinating, if somewhat exhausting journey. Any final thoughts for our listeners as they try to process all this information?
This document is like a window into how a lot of conservatives think about the role of government.
Yeah.
It's a bold vision, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with it or not, it's worth understanding what they're proposing and how it might affect the country if they get the chance to put these ideas into action.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that ideas have consequences. The choices we make about who governs us and what policies we support have a real impact on our lives. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us, everyone. We'll be back next week with another fascinating look at the world of politics and policy.